Beneath the cobblestone streets of Vienna, in the bowels of the earth where no light dared to linger, the dungeon breathed with the stench of despair. Its walls were slick with centuries of tears, its stones blackened by smoke and damp, and every drop of water that fell from the ceiling echoed like a drumbeat in the silence of the damned. This was not a place of justice, but of unraveling, a theater where mercy had long since been erased, where the human body was reduced to flesh and sinew to be torn, twisted and broken until only obedience remained. Here knelt Balthasar Hubmaier, once a man of fire and faith, now reduced to a figure bound in iron. His wrists were raw, torn by shackles that cut deeper with every trembling breath. His eyes, hollow from sleepless nights, still burned faintly, not with hope, but with a defiance that clung like a dying ember, refusing to surrender to the cold wind. Around him the air reeked of rot and old blood, a reminder that countless others had passed through these same stones, their names swallowed by silence, their bodies forgotten by all but the dungeon walls. He had known the rack, that monstrous invention of cruelty, designed not merely to punish, but to unmake the very structure of man. They had stretched him across its timber frame until his bones shrieked like splintering wood, his tendons straining as if to tear themselves from their sockets. With each turn of the wheel, the ropes dug deeper, grinding muscle into pulp, forcing marrow against marrow until agony was no longer a scream, but a silence too great to carry. Iron spikes had been pressed against his joints, cruel teeth biting into living flesh, twisting until pain became a fire that licked at every nerve. It was not death they sought from him, but betrayal, a word, a name, a confession that would make his torment meaningful in the eyes of his captors. Yet even when his voice cracked, even when his body convulsed against the restraints, the words they hungered for never came. His silence was his last weapon, and he wielded it with the desperation of a man who had nothing left but truth. Yet there, in the shadows of his agony, sat Elizabeth, his wife. She bore no rack, no iron claws tearing her flesh, no wheel stretching her bones. Her torment was different, crueler still. She was made to sit, to wait, to endure the sight of her husband's body shattered piece by piece. Every cry he uttered carved itself into her, deeper than any blade, heavier than any chain. She was condemned not only to her own death, but to witness his suffering in its full measure, to watch love itself ground beneath the machinery of power. And in this cruel symmetry lay the harshest truth, that her sentence was not merely to drown in the Danube's black waters, but to carry the memory of his torment into that river, so that even her last breath would be stained with his agony. The dungeon was silent now, save for the drip of water and the faint rattle of chains. Torchlight flickered, casting their faces in fractured light. His gaunt, his beard darkened by dried blood, hers pale, her hair tangled, her eyes wide with the weight of grief too vast to name. They were not speaking. Words had long since lost their power in this place, and yet across the stone floor between them, something stronger passed. His trembling hand reached, the chains pulling taut, his fingers clawing desperately toward hers. She shifted, dragging her frail body forward until the tips of their hands brushed, clasping in the darkness. In that small gesture, defiance breathed again. Not in the form of rebellion, not in fiery sermons or proclamations, but in the quiet endurance of two souls refusing to be severed by iron or decree. They were bound not by chains, but by a vow stronger than steel, a covenant forged in faith, in love, in the refusal to yield to fear. In that touch, they reclaimed what the dungeon sought to strip away, their humanity. And so the dungeon, which had echoed with centuries of screams, now bore witness to silence. Silence not of defeat, but of endurance. For though flesh could be broken, though bodies could be cast into the black water of the Danube, the vow that joined Balthasar and Elizabeth lingered in the shadows. It was a vow the executioner's sword could not cut, a vow the river could not drown, a vow that whispered still in the dripping dark. Stronger than death, stronger than fear, stronger than chains. Daylight carved its way into the hall of judgment like a blade, piercing the gloom and setting the scene for a theater of power. The chamber was vast, its vaulted ceiling heavy with centuries of decrees and condemnations, the very air thick with incense and fear. Beneath towering arches, the bishops gathered, their robes of crimson draped like the plumage of vultures circling carrion. Around them, soldiers in gleaming steel stood rigid, their armor reflecting the fractured sunlight, their presence less for protection than for intimidation. This was not a court of justice, but a stage where authority performed its most ruthless drama. Dragged across the stone floor, Balthasar Hubmaier entered the arena of his undoing. His steps faltered, uneven from flesh already broken by torture. Shackles clinked at his ankles, iron scraping against the ground in a rhythm that echoed the inevitability of what was to come. His face was gaunt, framed by a beard stiff with dried blood, his body bent but not bowed. To the tribunal he appeared as a heretic, a traitor to the order they claimed was divine, to the faithful who still whispered his name beyond these walls. He was a witness, a voice for a truth that no prison could wholly contain. Accusations filled the chamber, shouted with a venom that reverberated through the marble halls. Heresy, rebellion, defiance of the church, the crimes for which the age had reserved its harshest punishments. Every syllable was a stone hurled against his humanity, every word a scaffold being raised in the minds of the onlookers. They did not question the evidence. They did not weigh his life. They demanded submission, and submission alone. Yet in the midst of this thunder, Balthasar raised his face. The bruises that marked him did not hide the fire that lingered in his eyes. His lips cracked as he spoke, but the words that emerged were unwavering, carved in conviction. Truth was not forged in steel, nor purified in flame. It was written in the conscience of man, inscribed by the hand of God upon the soul, beyond the reach of kings and bishops alike. They could silence his tongue, they could sever his head, they could cast his wife into the river's depths, but they could not extinguish the truth that had already taken root in the hearts of the people. The words did not soothe, they inflamed. The crowd hissed like a serpent disturbed, a chorus of rage and fear cloaked as righteousness. The bishops stiffened, their faces masks of authority, yet their eyes betrayed a glimmer of unease, as though the very defiance they sought to crush might yet outlive them. For truth, once spoken with blood behind it, carried a weight that no decree could dissolve. Then came the verdict. It was read with ritual precision, each word like a hammer striking an anvil, forging his fate in sound before it would be sealed in blood. Death by the sword, for the man who dared speak against the church. Death by drowning, for the woman who dared share his name, his vow, his cause. These were not sentences born of law, but proclamations meant for spectacle, punishment staged not only to destroy, but to terrify, to make examples out of flesh and bone. The hall was silent as the final words were spoken. Yet within that silence lay the cruelest blade, for in condemning them, the tribunal sought to carve their names from memory, to drown them not only in water and steel, but in the forgetting of history. Still, even as the decree fell like iron chains upon them, a whisper seemed to stir in the silence, that their deaths would not erase but engrave their defiance deeper into the world. Hubmaier stood in the midst of it all, his body trembling with exhaustion, but his spirit unbroken. He was already a dead man, yet he bore himself with the stillness of one who understood that death could be made into testimony. Elizabeth, though not present in the hall, bore the same sentence written across her fate. Husband and wife, joined not only in marriage but now in martyrdom, condemned together by a power that feared them even as it destroyed them. Thus ended the trial not in justice, but in theater. The hall of judgment was not a place of law. It was an altar upon which two lives were sacrificed for the illusion of order. And as the bishops turned away, and the soldiers dragged him back into the shadows, the trial itself became its own betrayal. Proof that the church, in its hunger for control, had become not shepherd, but executioner. Night pressed its weight upon the prison, a silence so thick it seemed to swallow the breath of the world. Within the narrow cell, a single candle fought against the dark, its flame trembling as though it too feared what dawn would bring. Shadows bled across the damp stones, stretching long and cruel, echoing the fate that awaited the two souls within. This was not simply a room of confinement, it was the antechamber of eternity, the place where love and death met face to face. Balthasar Hubmaier sat hunched against the wall, his body broken by the instruments of torture, his limbs heavy with chains that cut into his flesh. Every movement was agony, yet his suffering seemed only to deepen the dignity of his bearing. Beside him, Elizabeth leaned close, her frame frail, her face etched with exhaustion, but her spirit unbowed. She had been spared the rack and the lash, but not spared the torment of witnessing what cruelty had made of the man she loved. Her grief was not for her own death, that she knew would be swift, but for the endless hours of pain that had already been carved into his body. The candlelight shimmered over their hands as they clasped them together, two lives entwined by faith and devotion. No words were needed, for speech had become too fragile to bear the weight of what lay between them. Their silence was a language stronger than sound, a communion of glances and touches that defied the walls around them. In that silence was sorrow, but also defiance, a refusal to let fear unmake what they had been to one another. Outside the cell, the fortress of Vienna slumbered, its stones unaware of the tragedy it contained. Yet within these walls, history was being written in a script invisible to parchment and ink. It was written in the way Elizabeth's tears traced silent paths across her cheeks, not for herself, but for the man whose courage she would follow into the grave. It was written in the faint curve of Hubmaier's lips, a smile forced through blood and exhaustion, not to deny pain, but to offer her one last fragment of hope. Their love had been forged in sermons, in faith, in shared conviction. Now it was being sealed in chains and in shadows, consecrated by suffering, sanctified by the inevitability of death. The silence grew heavier, a silence broken only by the faint drip of water and the rasp of his breath. And then from beyond the cell came the sound that shattered their fragile reprieve, the echo of soldiers' boots striking stone in merciless rhythm. Each step drew nearer, carrying with it the weight of finality. The candle flickered wildly as if in warning, shadows leaping across the walls like specters. The door groaned open, its iron hinges crying out like a herald of doom. Torchlight flooded the cell, drowning the gentle glow of the candle in a blaze of harsh illumination. The soldiers entered, their armor clinking, their faces blank with the indifference of duty. Chains rattled as rough hands reached for them, tearing their embrace apart. Hubmaier was pulled toward the scaffold where steel awaited. Elizabeth was marked for the river, where black waters would rise to claim her. There was no time for farewell, no words left to be spoken. Their parting was not a moment, but a tearing, of bodies, of souls, of a vow made flesh. Yet even as they were dragged into the night, something lingered in the air between them, something no blade nor flood could sever. It was the memory of their last night, of hands entwined beneath the flicker of a failing candle, of love that endured until the very instant chains wrenched them apart. And so the prison bore witness to silence once more. Not the silence of surrender, but of eternity, the silence of two hearts that refused to break, even as the world conspired to destroy them. Morning broke over Vienna not with light, but with shadow. The air was thick with smoke from torches still burning from the night before, and with the murmurs of a crowd that had gathered not to witness justice, but to feed upon the spectacle of death. The marketplace, usually alive with barter and laughter, had transformed into an arena of silence and dread. Faces pressed together, some eager, some fearful, all united by the morbid gravity of what was about to unfold. The cobblestones trembled under the weight of thousands, their whispers rising like the drone of a swarm, each syllable carrying the scent of blood. At the center stood the scaffold, a crude platform of wood stained dark with the remnants of those who had knelt there before. Upon it, the executioner prepared his instrument. The sword glinted in the muted light, its blade dragged across the whetstone in slow, deliberate strokes. Each spark that leapt into the air burned like a firefly before dying into ash, as if even the smallest flames recoiled from the work to come. The sound of steel grinding against stone echoed through the square, a reminder to all present that this was no ordinary day. Balthasar Hubmaier was brought forth, his body weakened, his skin pale against the black robe draped upon him. He no longer bore the marks of a man merely imprisoned. He bore the scars of a body broken by torment. yet still carrying the weight of unyielding belief. The guards dragged him to the scaffold, and with each faltering step, the murmurs of the crowd swelled. Some hissed curses, branding him a heretic. Others whispered prayers beneath their breath, fearing the gaze of authority but unable to silence their pity. His presence divided the city, but his fate bound them all in a single, terrible moment. He knelt upon the block, not raising his eyes to the heavens, but to the faces of those who stood before him. He sought no vision of deliverance, no promise of divine escape. Instead, he looked upon the people, as if to leave them not with miracles, but with memory. His gaze was not one of despair, but of testimony. In that instant, the marketplace became a mirror, and every man, woman, and child saw themselves reflected in the stillness of the condemned. The executioner stepped forward. His hands were steady, his face a mask of indifference, for he was not the author of judgment, only its instrument. Yet even his measured breath betrayed the weight of what he was about to perform. The crowd fell silent, every murmur choked by the anticipation of steel. The narrator's voice lingered over the silence. This was not mercy, but ritual. Death here was not to free the body, but to humiliate it, to strip it of dignity before the eyes of a city. Each breath Hubmaier drew was poisoned by the hunger of the masses, who demanded blood as if it were sacrament. The sword rose, glinting cold as winter's frost, and for one heartbeat the world seemed to hold its breath. Then the steel descended, swift and final. A single stroke severed life from flesh, and the silence was broken by the thud of his body collapsing upon the wood. Blood spread across the platform, dark and unrelenting, seeping into the cracks of the scaffold as though claiming the very earth beneath. And yet, even headless, his silence spoke. It cried louder than sermons, louder than kings, louder than the accusations that had condemned him. In that instant, Vienna witnessed not the destruction of a heretic, but the birth of a martyr. The people murmured, some in curses, others in broken prayers, still others in whispers too faint to name. The city itself seemed to tremble, as though truth had collapsed beneath the weight of steel, only to rise again in the echoes that no blade could silence. Days passed, but the memory of steel in Vienna had not yet faded when the river was chosen to claim the second life. The Danube, swollen with rain and storm-gray skies, rolled onward like an ancient beast, its currents deep, dark, and merciless. Along its banks, soldiers gathered with their burden, and the people of the city came again, summoned by the morbid theater that had become their inheritance. They had seen the blade drink the blood of her husband. Now they were called to watch the waters swallow his wife. Elizabeth was led forth, her body slight against the strength of the men who dragged her. Her garments clung to her with the damp of the air, her hair unkempt, her face pale from days within the dungeon shadow. Coarse rope bit into her wrists and coiled around her ankles, each knot fastened with the certainty of death. Stones had been bound to her feet, weights meant not merely to drag her down, but to guarantee her erasure, to ensure that the river would claim her swiftly and without return. She did not resist. The crowd, accustomed to begging and screams, found themselves unsettled by her stillness. There were no pleas for mercy, no wails of terror. She carried herself with the quiet resolve of one who had already crossed beyond fear. The memory of her husband's fate lingered in her eyes, but not as despair, rather as an inheritance of courage, a torch passed from scaffold to riverbank. In her silence there was a strength greater than defiance, acceptance without surrender. The soldiers hauled her into a boat, their faces blank, their movements mechanical. They were not men carrying out justice. They were tools, extensions of a decree that sought to erase not only bodies, but belief itself. The oars dipped into the Danube, cutting through its surface as the vessel drifted toward deeper waters. Around them the current surged, restless, as though the river itself braced to consume its victim. The people lined the banks, their breath held against the storm. Some muttered prayers too faint to rise above the rush of the water. Others whispered curses, condemning her as the partner of a heretic. Yet beneath both hatred and pity, all shared in the weight of the spectacle. For in her slight form, bound in rope and stone, they saw not only one woman's fate, but the echo of their own fragility beneath the hand of power. At the river's heart, the soldiers moved with ritual precision. They tightened the knots, their coarse hands pulling until the rope dug deep into her skin. The stone weights shifted with a dull thud against the planks, heavy as the verdict that had condemned her. The sky above was dark, the clouds low and churning, as though heaven itself bowed to watch. Elizabeth was raised to the edge of the boat. For a moment she stood suspended between earth and abyss, between the gaze of the people and the hunger of the river. There was no struggle, no cry, only the stillness of a soul prepared. Then, with the finality of duty, the soldiers thrust her forward. The Danube opened its mouth and swallowed her whole. The surface erupted in violent silence, a spray of water breaking against the hull as her body plunged into the depths. Bubbles rose, frantic, shimmering like fragments of breath clawing their way toward the sky, then fading, collapsing into nothing. The river closed over her, seamless and eternal, carrying her away in its dark current. The boat drifted back, the soldiers expressionless, the crowd hushed. Upon the surface of the Danube, there was no sign of what had been taken. The water flowed on, indifferent, as though it had not just consumed a life, but merely fulfilled its endless course. Yet within that indifference lay a cruel truth, that the river, meant to erase, would instead remember. For every current that rolled toward the horizon bore the weight of her sacrifice, a memory flowing deeper than stone, stronger than rope, beyond the reach of those who sought to silence her. And so the Danube kept its secret, its black waters carrying her into eternity, even as the city turned away. The crowd dispersed, the soldiers marched, the storm clouds drifted. But in the whispers that lingered, in the hearts that trembled, Elizabeth remained, not drowned, but immortal. Above the city of Vienna, the bells began to toll. Their sound was not triumphant, but mournful, heavy with the weight of what had been done. Each strike rolled across rooftops and through alleyways, sinking into the marrow of the city like a funeral drum. To the authorities, it was the sound of order restored, heresy crushed, rebellion silenced. But to others, it was the tolling of a deeper truth, a truth that rang not in victory, but in lament. From the scaffold to the riverbank, Vienna carried the memory of two deaths. Steel had severed the preacher, water had consumed the wife, yet neither blade nor current could fully bury what they had sought to destroy. In hidden corners, behind shuttered windows, believers whispered their names. Balthasar, Elizabeth, as though speaking them too loudly might draw the same fate upon themselves. Their names passed from lips to lips in secret, hushed like contraband, fragile as prayer, but enduring nonetheless. Each whisper became a seed, carried in silence, buried in sorrow, waiting for its season to bloom. For martyrdom is never an end. It is a beginning. Blood spilled on stone seeps, deeper than the eye can see. It buries itself in the cracks of memory, where it takes root. It grows not in sunlight, but in shadow, watered by grief, nourished by the courage of those left behind. The scaffold had been built to end a voice. The river had been chosen to erase a life. Yet both became monuments of another kind, not of stone or marble, but of memory, monuments that lived in the hearts of men and women who would rather die than betray the truth written within them. Vienna tried to move on. Markets returned to their trade. Sermons were preached from pulpits. Soldiers marched in polished steel, as though the city itself had not conspired to unmake two lives. But the silence left behind was heavier than any sound. It lingered in the marketplace where blood had darkened the wood, in the currents of the Danube where bubbles had risen and vanished, in the chambers where chains still hung from walls. Silence is never empty. It is a vessel, carrying echoes forward, carrying them into the conscience of a generation that could not forget. In that silence, their story endured, not in monuments of marble, for none were built, not in triumphal chronicles, for history sought to erase them. They endured instead in the courage of the nameless, in the whispers of mothers who told their children of a preacher who would not betray his conscience, of a wife who walked into the river without fear. They endured in the trembling prayers of believers meeting in hidden rooms, where their names were spoken not in despair but in hope. They endured in every act of defiance that placed truth above fear, conscience above command. Steel silenced the preacher. Water consumed the wife. Yet their deaths did not end their story. Instead, they carved it deeper into the fabric of time. Vienna could bury their bodies, but not their faith. The Danube could swallow their flesh, but not their courage. The silence they left behind became their voice, echoing across centuries, echoing still in the hearts of those who listen. And so the story closes, not in victory, not in defeat, but in endurance. The bells fade, the streets empty, the scaffold stands abandoned. Yet the sound of the river lingers, flowing endlessly onward, carrying with it the memory of Balthasar and Elizabeth. The water does not speak, but it remembers, and in that remembrance they live.